How far can a lie be carried on, as today's story shows, quite long when it involves a family member? The worst is when this familial bond is abused for selfish purposes, for sometimes it destroys destinies down to their foundations. On May 10, 2003, Joey Fulgham failed to show up at the air show he was eager to attend. The following day was Mother's Day, another significant event he ignored, though he had always congratulated his loved ones and spent time with them before. After these two incidents, the relatives of the man realized something was wrong. His mother and sister went to his house and saw a horrifying sight. Joey lay face down on his bed with a huge hole in his head, obviously from a gunshot to the back of the head. The family immediately reported the gruesome discovery to the emergency services, 911. The police officers arrived at the scene and began investigating. They first spoke with the mother and sister of the deceased, who had discovered the body. They were very distraught but answered the questions quite appropriately. In their opinion, only his wife, Christy, with whom he had a complicated relationship, could have killed the man. Christy did not hide her affairs and dreamed of getting rid of her annoying husband. This led investigators to the main suspect, who was not at home. The police found Christy at her mother's house in the neighboring small town of Little Rock. When questioned, she acted as if she knew nothing about what had happened. When the investigators told her about the tragedy, she started crying and mourning the loss of her husband. The police found nothing suspicious in her behavior and continued to gather evidence. It was only later that the real case against Christy came to light. However, before she was arrested, she and her paternal half-brother voluntarily went to the police station in Starkville. In the sheriff's office, 27-year-old Christy told the police what had really happened. According to the young woman's confession, her 13-year-old half-brother Tyler was visiting the family home on the morning Joe was killed. There was a serious conflict between the couple during which her husband raised his hand against her. According to Christy, her brother was angry about his behavior and wanted to protect his sister. Of course, he was physically unable to deal with an adult man alone, so he thought of another way out. Tyler took a rifle and shot the sleeping man in the back of the head. At the same time, the investigators also questioned Tyler. They began talking to the boy without an adult or lawyer present, which was obviously a violation and later played a role in the case. The boy's mother was informed of the incident and immediately came to the station. Initially, the teenager denied being involved in the murder, but then his statement changed when his sister entered the room and gave a sign. The boy repeated his sister's story, but with new details. He confessed that he and Christy had sneaked into the bedroom in the early morning hours, pulled the trigger of the rifle, and shot their husband. This was a real shock to the mother when she heard the confession. She literally fell to her knees and cried. It was clear that the 13-year-old could not have committed the act alone, as the child simply did not have the strength to handle a weapon properly. According to the student's statement, he really could not pull the trigger himself and therefore needed his sister's help. In this way, the police obtained a confession, and the boy was considered the initiator of the act and his sister as an accomplice. According to Tyler, he had previously given his sister the murder weapon. It was an old family rifle of caliber .22, which Christy had asked for a few weeks before the act. The sister had been afraid of the big dog that constantly ran into the couple's garden and wanted to be armed to protect herself and the children. Tyler, of course, did not want Christy and her children to be injured, so he willingly handed over the shotgun. Still, the schoolboy complied with her request. He had always been very fond of animals and had even fed stray dogs. That's why he literally begged Christy not to kill the dog. She finally convinced the student that she would simply shoot into the air in case of danger from a dog, just to scare away the annoying animal. Tyler was convinced that the weapon would not work at all. In his opinion, it was a very old rifle that had been gathering dust in the attic for years. For over a year, he and his friends had tried to make it functional again because the weapon was damaged. He had never managed to repair the family heirloom, which the young man wanted to use for sport shooting, so he was sure it was not dangerous. On the eve of the act, a Friday, it was Tyler's sister who was supposed to pick him up from school. However, she was out with her lover, Keel, and so preoccupied with the new man that she forgot the time. She arrived a few hours late to pick up her brother, picked him up, and brought him to her house. After returning from school, the sister took Tyler to the garden to test the rifle. The young man's suspicions were confirmed in the backyard. Just a day before the murder, the rifle had not fired. Afterward, Christy stored the non-functioning weapon in the trunk of her car. The teenager knew it was there. Something about the student's story did not match his sister's version. He was confused about how they stood during the shooting and how they held the weapon. Despite his confession, the description of the murder seemed far-fetched, and several facts did not match the words of the young man. After the confession, the young man contacted the investigators a few days later. He wrote a retraction of his earlier statement. According to the student, he took the blame because he wanted to protect his half-sister. He believed that because of his age, he would not go to prison himself and therefore willingly took responsibility. As a result, he now faces a life sentence. The young man expressed a new version of the events. According to him, the 13-year-old Tyler was on his way to his father with his older half-sister on May 10, 2003. The night before, he had stayed at his sister's house. On Saturday morning, Tyler was woken early by his sister's alarm to get ready for the trip. The teenager got into Chrissy's car, and his sister asked him to wait with her daughter. They sat in the car for about 5 minutes. The young man was just tuning the radio when he heard a loud bang from inside the house. He still thought the rifle was in the trunk of the car, so he did not pay much attention to the noise. Christy had a cat that often knocked various objects down, so they broke. So, the student thought it was the same this time. Besides, Christy came out of the house as if nothing had happened, got into the car, and, according to Tyaz's statement, they drove away calmly. Only on the way back did the sister admit that she had killed Joey with the shotgun. The young man was shocked. Christy cried and pleaded with her brother to save her from the death penalty, whereupon he promised to take part of the blame, although he did not realize what punishment he would receive. Could Tyler really be the one who shot his sister's husband? To answer this question, the police officers had to take a closer look at the family's life. Tyler and CH went to the same school. She was much older and graduated earlier. As a student, Tyler was always a smart and hard-working child, kind, friendly, and quiet. Moreover, he was a sociable boy who easily found a common language with classmates and other people. He seemed to have a bright future ahead of him, as pure as his heart. Tyler's mother, Sharon, raised the child alone. The parents divorced early because the father showed aggression. The boy lost the opportunity to see him. This happened against the background of the man's abusive behavior, which had long oppressed his wife. Finally, Sharon's patience ran out, and she could no longer endure his behavior. The woman filed for divorce and received full custody of the child. To protect Tyler, she excluded contact with the biological father, even under the supervision of social workers. Tyler's paternal half-sister, Christy Fould, knew that the boy still wanted to meet his father despite the mother's ban and the court order. He was still attached to the man and wanted to see him at least occasionally. To establish contact and spend time together, his half-sister, Christy, decided to help Tyler see his father against his mother's wishes. One day, she asked the young man if he wanted to spend the weekend in the house where his father lived. At that time, Christy was the only connection to his family. She herself was a very important person to the young man, whom he greatly appreciated and respected. The 13-year-old Tyler agreed. He was very excited about the weekend so that he could meet his father. At that time, the 27-year-old Christy was married. She lived with her husband, Joey, and their 3 children in their house. When Joey first met Christy, he was truly enchanted. She seemed the epitome of beauty and moral principles, a woman with so much intelligence. Christy was a pleasant person, beautiful in appearance, and perfect in her ability to use her natural charm. Yet all this later became the reason for a breakup. She turned out to be promiscuous and selfish, thinking only of herself and ignoring her spouse's feelings. Christy did not even hide particularly from him, knowing about her regular adventures, but turned a blind eye to everything. She preferred to start a family not to anger her parents, just to be like the others. At the same time, she began romances with various men under this guise. Joey sincerely loved Christy, but she was not interested in his feelings. Her husband was just a cover for her. The most astonishing secret in the young woman's life was the fact that she was loved by everyone around her: half-brother, husband, father, many lovers, but she did not really love anyone. Christy used people without having any qualms about it, and her ability to skillfully manipulate men helped her in this. As it turned out later, her loved ones suffered the most from this trait. Christy had a significant influence on her young brother, as repeatedly admitted by her family. Both had the same biological father. From a young age, she was very close to Tyr, which would bring him a cruel future. Of course, he had no idea of Chrissy's insidious plan at the time. The sister used Tyr's desire to meet his father to gain additional control over his mind and heart. She constantly asked her brother to lie to her husband and other friends so that she would not be caught in her intrigues. CHR also used Tyler to look after her and even to clean her house. Once, Christy tried to convince her brother that she would be a better guardian for him than his own mother, but Tyler was not deterred by these plans. He could not abandon his mother. In fact, Tyr's mother had long suspected before the events in question that Christy was mentally ill. She behaved like a manipulative person, became increasingly angry and aggressive, and snapped at relatives over trifles. All this happened spontaneously and could not be controlled. Naturally, her relatives long attributed this to stress or other usual reasons. Unfortunately, the reality was much worse. The young woman became angrier, and the culprit of all her problems was her loving husband, Joey. Nevertheless, her mother did not forbid Tyler to communicate with his sister. They were very close, and it seemed that despite her strange behavior, she posed no danger. Both involved in the murder were arrested and charged with murder, a crime punishable by death under Mississippi law. According to the judge's ruling, the young man was tried as an adult because of the severity of the crime. However, due to his young age, he could not be sentenced to death. Therefore, it was expected that the teenager would receive a life sentence without parole. At the same time, Christy faced the lethal injection. The trial against Tyre Edmonds began on July 20, 2004. It was a high-profile and widely watched case, for the main character of the brutal massacre was a 13-year-old student. The teenager was defended by one of the best lawyers in the state. He was convinced that his client's initial confession was a lie made under pressure from his older sister. The defense also believed that the confession had been coerced by police pressure. The child admitted that he had been very scared during his interrogation, especially since he was initially questioned without his mother and his lawyer, which constituted a violation. The only physical evidence in this case, apart from the bullet, were Christy's fingerprints on the porch and the motion detectors of the lamp. The lamps were turned off at the time of the murder, probably to avoid attracting the attention of the neighbors. Christy's fingerprints were also found on the weapon. The young man emphasized that he had only made the false confession to save his sister from the death penalty, and he believed that because of his age, he would get away with a mild punishment, However, when he realized that he could receive a real sentence, he became scared and refused to help his sister. After the judge's decision, however, only Tyer's confession, not the retraction of the student's statement during the trial, was presented by the prosecution. Moreover, the prosecution was represented by an expert who claimed he could determine from the nature of the injuries with certainty that the rifle had indeed been held by two people. As a result, the expert could not convincingly explain how he came to this conclusion. Despite the absurdity of this statement, the expert's words played an important role at the hearing. The jurors were shown a video of the young man's confession, and the statement of a respected expert with extensive experience as a forensic scientist was played. No further arguments were presented. The jurors deliberated for about 5 hours before reaching their decision. The defense was sure that the young man would be acquitted due to the weak evidence. Nevertheless, on July 24, 2004, a 15-year-old student was found guilty of murdering Joey Fulgham. The young man was sentenced to life imprisonment. After the verdict was announced, the defense immediately filed an appeal. He did not stop fighting for justice and tried to obtain a review of Tyer's case. Indeed, numerous errors in the work of the investigators were identified. The prosecution relied only on circumstantial evidence, and the most important evidence was the young man's own confession. However, his defense was sure that the confession had been coerced either by force or with the help of psychological tricks mastered by the interrogating officers. Since it was a minor, namely a schoolboy, the officers had more influence on the child who was left alone with them. Despite the efforts of his lawyer, the young man ended up in prison. Mississippi had very strict laws, making it extremely difficult to obtain an appeal for an already convicted offender. Nevertheless, the lawyer did not give up hope, nor did the people close to Tyer who knew him well. Most refused to believe that the young man could have committed such a cold-blooded murder. He had a good relationship with all family members, including Joey. He neither suffered from mental illness nor other disorders, and the young man had no motive for the murder at all. Christie's story sounded long-winded, and many were convinced that the student's conviction was the result of a miscarriage of justice and his confession the result of manipulation by his half-sister. The lawyer for the teenager was determined. The defender was aware that the only way to revise the verdict was to make it as public as possible. However, even then, the review would take years. Tyer's trial became the subject of public debate. The excitement about the trial was so great that even legislators intervened and wanted to revise the existing criminal law. Finally, in January 2007, a glimmer of hope emerged. The Supreme Court of Mississippi agreed to review Tyer's case. Finally, the defender managed to attract the attention of the court system. At that time, the teenager had already spent almost 4 years behind bars. The main problem was the statement of the expert who convinced everyone that two people were holding the rifle. In fact, he could not determine from the bullet's trajectory how many people were holding the rifle when the shot was fired. His statement was refuted by other experts and classified as biased. Afterward, the Mississippi prosecution was in a quandary, as it had no other evidence. The prosecution offered Tyer a deal, which would have made the case much easier and reduced the sentence. The young man might even have been released from prison directly, as he had already served a sufficient sentence. However, Tyer did not want freedom in this case, but basically to prove his innocence. Of course, there was a small risk that the young man could be found guilty again and the life sentence confirmed. Despite this possibility, the young man rejected the offer of the prosecution. He claimed he was innocent and did not want to take responsibility for someone else's crime. On October 28, 2008, Tyer's retrial began. His lawyer saw the case as a personal battle. In his opening statement, the lawyer emphasized that the 13-year-old boy had been charged as an adult criminal. Many mistakes had been made during the investigations. The police officers had not respected the child's rights during the interrogation. Moreover, the law enforcement authorities immediately focused on proving the student's guilt after the confession but did not even try to verify his statements. At the same time, there were significant discrepancies between the confession and the evidence, and the investigators recognized these inconsistencies. The authorities had only circumstantial evidence, some of which completely contradicted the young man's statements. To confirm his statements, the defender called the young man's sister, Christy Fulgham, to the stand, as he believed this was the best way to refute the prejudice. The defender believed that Tyler's sister would tell the truth, but this plan did not work out. On the advice of her lawyer, the sister refused to answer any questions. Although the expectations were not met, this behavior helped to clarify to the jurors who Christy really was and that she had something to hide. From the beginning, she pursued selfish goals. The fate of her half-brother, whom she wanted to blame despite his loyalty and young age, was completely indifferent to her. Unlike Tyler, Christy actually had a valid motive for murder. Joey had taken out a life insurance policy for $300,000, which could have been another reason to get rid of her annoying husband. In the couple's circle of acquaintances, they found witnesses who confirmed the widow's selfish intentions. Just before the murder, she had tried to find out how much money she would receive in the event of her husband's death. This was not possible, however, as Joey had written a confidentiality statement. But Christy was still confident that it was a good deal and that she would be the beneficiary of the payout. Christy's father appeared in court and told how his daughter had asked him to give her a gun and help her kill her husband, offering as a reward to buy her father a new Cadell from the insurance payout she would receive. The man, however, steadfastly refused to participate in the crime and advised his daughter to divorce her husband if she did not like him. Christy sharply countered that she would then not receive the insurance and would have to share the assets. This was, of course, not favorable for her. Another reason to get rid of her husband was that he had found out that the youngest child was not his but from his best friend, and he intended to file for divorce. The lawyer was convinced that Christy had intended to kill her husband anyway. However, she used her brother's presence to shift the responsibility onto him. Christy was known for her manipulative nature, and so she simply got the student to make a much-publicized confession with the help of her influence on her brother. Tyler Edmonds was a 13-year-old high school student with honors at the time of the murder. The young man was not violent and had never been associated with criminal activities. He showed no interest in gangs. Tyler had not once been noticed for antisocial behavior. The teenager was a real role model, respected his elders, and regularly attended the local church. The young man had an active lifestyle, played sports, and was everyone's favorite. No one believed he could have been involved in a violent crime. The biggest problems for the defense only began later when the prosecution presented a video recording to the jurors in which Tyler confessed to the crime. In the video, the young man clearly said that he had actually helped Christy kill her husband. The jurors were shown the video of the teenager's confession, but not the entire video. The moment when the sister entered the room and essentially forced her brother to confess was not shown. This became a major obstacle to proving his innocence. To refute the prosecution's argument, the defense had to convince the jurors that this eloquent statement was false and made under duress. For this purpose, the defense should have called in an expert on facial expressions and gestures, the very person the defender had relied on when developing his tactics. Unfortunately, the judge prohibited the statement of this expert, which severely shook confidence in the victory. Thereupon, the defender changed direction and decided to focus on the discrepancies in the man's statements. In fact, there were several suspicious moments in his confession. First, he reported that he had seen a whole fountain of blood after the shot. According to an independent judicial expert, however, There could not have been a fountain of blood when he was hit in the head. Such a wound does not bleed immediately, and there could have been no blood splatter. In fact, the deceased was only shot once with a .22 caliber rifle, resulting in a single entry wound, and the skull remained intact. The young man had obviously made it all up. All this resembled a childish fantasy. The real picture was unknown to the teenager because he was not in Joe's bedroom at the time of the execution. The fact that the judge allowed the use of videos denying his confession during the retrial also played into Dirt's hands. These had not been shown to the jurors at the previous hearing. In his counterstatement, the convicted man gave the police a different version of events, which differed significantly from his confession. According to him, Joey, Tyler, and CHR were on a short trip early on the morning of the murder day to meet the student's father. The young man sat in the car when he heard a suspicious noise in the house. However, he did not bother to check what had happened. Christy left the house very quickly. They made the trip, and on the way back, the sister confessed to the murder of her spouse. Moreover, Christy immediately began asking her brother to take part of the blame for the massacre. She believed this would help her escape the death penalty. Her sister was completely indifferent to the fate of Tyler, who had not even finished school. Tyler agreed because he wanted to help her and protect Christy. On October 31, 2008, the last day of Tyler's retrial arrived. The outcome depended on which version of the defendant's words the jurors believed. The defendant was to present his defense that day. He admitted that he had pleaded guilty because Christy had convinced him that the teenager would not go to prison. At the same time, she believed that her brother's confession would enable her to escape the death penalty and save her life. According to the teenager, they agreed that Christy would signal him to take the blame for the act, but they did not discuss what the signal would look like. He received it as CHR entered the interrogation room after the murder and sat next to him. She took the young man's hand and gave the signal. But the brother did not take full blame as Christy wanted. When asked about their joint involvement in the case, Christy, as it turned out before she gave the signal in the next room during the interrogation, initially claimed there had been an accident in which her husband was seriously injured and killed. However, under police pressure, she gave in. She decided, however, to drag her brother down with her. After the closing arguments of the prosecution, the defender also gave a closing statement. In his opinion, the prosecution had really no evidence besides the confession of the 13-year-old child that directly linked him to the murder. At the same time, the defender doubted that the words of the child, who was obviously under pressure, could be taken seriously. The wait for the verdict of the jurors seemed to last an eternity. When the jurors returned, the men and women declared that the 19-year-old Tyler was innocent. After 5 years in prison, the wrongfully convicted young man was finally free. For the family of the deceased, however, the question of justice remained open. Joey's parents just wanted to know the truth. They were no longer interested in revenge or in punishing someone for a murder. All the mother and father wanted to know was what exactly happened on that fateful day. After his release from prison, Tyler returned to his normal life. He completed college and earned a medical degree. The young man made sure to obtain a higher education in the chosen profession. Afterward, the young man left Mississippi and moved to Florida, where no one knew him, and lives there to this day. In many interviews, the wrongfully convicted admitted that the consequences of the false accusations still haunt him. It is impossible to forget the 5.5 years in prison that ruined his life, but he could get used to normal life. After the incident, Tyler concluded that police officers should not only make video recordings during a limited period of interaction with suspects when it suits them but continuously so that all details are visible. Moreover, children should only speak to the police in the presence of a parent and a lawyer so that they are not pressured. In many states, children can only speak to police officers in the presence of their parents. However, this is not an effective measure to protect teenagers, for not all parents are familiar with the criminal code and their rights. There are many cases where these basic, seemingly self-evident rules are not followed. Therefore, involving a lawyer is quite an appropriate measure. After the retrial and acquittal of Teer, prosecutors became interested in the activities of the forensic scientist Stephen Henn, who insisted that he had determined from the trajectory of the bullet how many people were holding the rifle. This publicity-grabbing statement called into question the competence and objectivity of the specialist. Other cases in which he had appeared as an expert were analyzed. It turned out that in at least 2 controversial cases, the decision had also been based on the questionable conclusions of the expert. As a result, in 2008, 2 more men were released. This happened after receiving DNA material found on the victim's body. After careful analysis, it was confirmed that it did not match the profiles of the 2 convicted men. The miscarriage of justice was finally confirmed after the real murderer confessed, which once again confirmed the incompetence of this expert. He was eventually dismissed from the proceedings. As for Christie, after the first trial, she was sentenced to only 12 years in prison for complicity. While serving this sentence, the criminal used her talent for manipulation to convince 2 cellmates to help her escape. However, the plan failed. In 2008, she found herself in a retrial for the murder of Joey Fulgham due to her brother's acquittal. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. The lawyer filed an appeal in 2010, and after a new trial, the death sentence was overturned. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. Afterward, Christie wrote an apology letter to her half-brother. It was actually just a short note that said, "I'm sorry, you know why?" Of course, this cynical letter only made the young man angry. He had lost almost 6 years of his life to a sentence for a crime he had not committed because of his sister, and she did not even have the courage or the right words to write a proper letter. Tyler has completely cut off his relationship with his half-sister. He is sure that she only got close to him because she wanted to use him in some way for her own selfish purposes. Of course, no one could have suspected at the time that this would land the young man behind bars. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourself.
Zemma Jangestig was born on August 19 in Stockholm, where she spent most of her childhood and youth. She grew up in a simple family and was the younger of 2 daughters. Her older sister's name was Kotina. At the age of 19, she married a young man named Nicholas, whom she had already met at school. He was not much older than Emma, and at the time of the wedding, she was already expecting a child. At 20, Emma became a mother for the first time, giving birth to a son whom she named Max. A year and a half later, she had a daughter named Saga. But despite the birth of 2 children together, the couple was too young and not ready for family life and domestic challenges. They constantly argued over trivial matters, could not find common ground, and soon decided to separate after their daughter's birth. The question of child custody was resolved harshly and painfully. Nicholas wanted not only to financially support the children but also to actively participate in their lives and upbringing. Emma had no objection, but soon she was in a new romantic relationship. Emma moved with her new lover to a small town called Oriwa, located about 150 km from Stockholm, and took the children with her. Her ex-husband was against it because he wanted to see his son and daughter every day. The ex-spouses met in court more than once, trying to resolve the issue, and Nicholas even threatened Emma, whereupon she immediately notified the police. However, the problems could not be resolved peacefully, and each parent began to seek sole custody. Emma met a man named Torgny Hellberg online. They quickly understood each other, grew closer, and had an affair. The young man was not bothered that the 23-year-old already had 2 children from a previous marriage, as he had long dreamed of a family and was willing to accept them as his own children. Initially, the couple lived in a small house that Torgny had inherited, but when they decided to get married, they moved to a larger apartment where they could live comfortably and each child could have their own cozy room. At this time, Torgny had a good job with a decent salary, and Emma was busy raising small children and creating a cozy home. As a trained designer, she planned to work in her field again in the future. The couple intended to marry in the summer of 2008, but these plans were not to be fulfilled. March 17, 2008 was a perfectly normal Monday. Torgny went to work early in the morning and Emma stayed home with 3-year-old Max and 1.5-year-old Saga. In the evening, she cooked dinner because her fiancé was on his way back. In the meantime, Emma chatted online with her sister Kotina, discussing a gift for their parents' upcoming wedding anniversary. Around 7:30 p.m., Emma received a call from Torgny, who told her he would be late from work and would come home a bit later so she could start dinner without him. After the brief conversation, Emma continued with her household chores. She fed the children and then sat back down at the computer to continue her correspondence with her sister. At 7:07 p.m., their communication was suddenly interrupted mid-word. Kotina found this strange because she saw her sister typing a message but not sending it. 5 minutes later, she called Emma, but she didn't answer. Then Kotina called Torgny to find out what had happened. The young man was on his way home and approaching the house. He assured Kotina that everything was fine, Emma was probably distracted by the children and would call back as soon as possible. But when Torgny arrived at the door, he was surprised. The front door was unlocked. Once inside, he noticed the mess. At first, Torgny thought it was the children playing and scattering their belongings, but then he saw the brownish red stains on the floor. When he realized with horror that it was blood, Torgny began to call out Emma's name and the children's names loudly, but no one responded. In the corridor, Torgny noticed a strange object on the floor. At first, he thought it was a doll because the figure lay in a completely unnatural pose. But as he got closer, he realized it was Saga lying in a pool of her own blood. Her head and face were mutilated beyond recognition and transformed into a bloody mess. A little further away, her brother lay in a similarly gruesome condition with a shattered skull. Their mother also lay on the floor, covered in blood and in an unnatural pose, severely broken and disfigured. None of them seemed to show any signs of life. The shocked Torgny, with trembling hands, pulled out his phone and dialed the emergency number to report what had happened. At that moment, Emma suddenly shuddered and let out a long groan. Police and paramedics immediately arrived at the scene, found a faint pulse in all 3 victims, and quickly began resuscitation. The scene was horrifying. No one could imagine who could have inflicted such an atrocity on a young woman and her children. But first, all efforts were directed towards getting the victims to the nearest hospital and trying to save their lives. The paramedics who arrived there doubted from the start that the victims would even make it to the hospital. However, all 3 were still alive when they were brought to the hospital. All were diagnosed with open head injuries with severe brain damage and significant blood loss. The doctors gave no prognosis but did everything they could. Max and Saga were in critical condition. Even if they could be saved, the chances of them breathing on their own were minimal. The mother's condition was classified as very serious but stable. The young woman was put into an artificial coma and connected to life support machines, hoping her body would cope. While the doctors fought for the victims' lives, forensic scientists worked at the crime scene, trying to find evidence and reconstruct a picture of what had happened. The house was chaotic, with scattered objects and blood on the floor and walls. Unfortunately, the paramedics had left a mess because they moved objects to get to the victims. The floor where Emma, Max, and Saga lay was trampled, and now investigators had to figure out which prints were left by the paramedics and which belonged to the perpetrator. It is noteworthy that the assailant committed the massacre in a maximum of 13 minutes. Emma's last message was sent at 7:07 p.m., and by 7:20 p.m., Torgny had already called the police and reported the incident. The brutality with which the perpetrator massacred the victims suggests a personal hatred for them. The murder weapon was most likely a heavy blunt object, presumably a hammer, with which the perpetrator struck his victims. However, nothing of the sort was found at the crime scene, leading to the conclusion that the perpetrator took it with him. Torgny Hellberg was the first suspect. He was not married to Emma and was not the father of her children. Investigators suspected that an argument between the two could have escalated into a massacre. The gruff man was immediately interrogated, but he had a solid alibi. Firstly, he was indeed late for work, which was confirmed by his boss and colleagues. Secondly, at the time of the brutal massacre of his loved ones, he was on the street and was captured by several surveillance cameras. Nevertheless, Torgny was asked to give a detailed statement. Perhaps he had seen or heard something important that would help the investigation. However, he could remember little. Everything was as usual until he saw the chaos and the blood-soaked bodies on the floor. The first thing that alarmed him was the unlocked front door, which could mean that Emma herself had let the perpetrator in. After the interrogation, the man was released. By this time, he had already informed Emma's family about the incident, and her parents, along with her older sister Kotina, drove by car from Stockholm directly to the hospital to visit the victims. But on the way there, they heard the terrible news on the radio. Max and Saga had died from their injuries without regaining consciousness. The next suspect was Emma's ex-husband and father of the children, Nicholas. The two had been divorced for over a year, and the separation had not been easy. The ex-spouses often argued and fought over child custody, and Nicholas even threatened Emma, which she reported to the police. Everything seemed to clear up after the separation. The young woman took the children and moved to another city with her new lover. After the father failed to obtain custody through legal means, he decided out of hatred for Emma to take a desperate step and in a fit of rage kill them all. Nicholas was quickly found and taken into custody, but the man was devastated by the news of Max's and Saga's deaths, crying and constantly asking if it was an accident. When he was suspected in this case, he was initially shocked and then screamed that he would never harm his children, whom he loved dearly. When asked about his whereabouts at the time of the crime, Nicholas said he was on a business trip in another city. That sounded strange, but soon his alibi was confirmed. At the time of the massacre, he was indeed 200 km from the crime scene. Forensic experts continued to work at the crime scene, trying to find clues, traces, or evidence that could point to the perpetrator. However, the perpetrator had obviously worn gloves and left no fingerprints. As for shoe prints, the situation was more complicated. After all, dozens of paramedics were in the house, providing aid and removing the victims. Now, all prints had to be collected to find out which ones did not belong to the paramedics, Torgny, or the victims. The police feared that after learning Emma had survived, the perpetrator might sneak into the hospital and finish the act. After all, she was an important witness. If she regained consciousness and could testify, she would surely betray him. For this reason, Emma's room was guarded around the clock. Meanwhile, the police searched the neighborhood for possible witnesses. A woman recalled seeing a suspicious stranger in black clothing near Emma's and Torgny's house around 5 p.m. It seemed strange to her, but she couldn't recognize the man's face because it was covered by a hood. However, the neighbor suspected it might have been a woman, as the figure was small and fragile. The same figure in black clothing and with a hood over her head was recorded by a surveillance camera installed outside a store near the crime scene. The police also assumed the footage showed a delicate woman, But who was she, and why would she want to harm Emma and her children? They decided to show the tape to Torgny to see if he had any idea who the stranger was. Already during the first few seconds of the footage, the man's face turned pale, and he said it could be his ex-girlfriend, 31-year-old Christine Schurer, although he wasn't 100% sure. Torgny's ex-girlfriend, Christine Schurer, was born in 1977 in Hanover, Germany. When she was still a child, her father left the family and practically stopped communicating with his daughter. This negatively affected her mental state and behavior. Christine grew up stubborn and determined, but with a rather complex character. As a teenager, she went to the USA as part of an exchange program and lived in New York for several years. She received a good education in history and archaeology and traveled extensively through Europe to participate in excavations and expeditions. In the summer of 2006, she traveled to the island of Crete in Greece, where she got a job as a tour guide in a hotel. There in July, 26-year-old Torgny came for a vacation, whom Christine immediately noticed. She also liked the intelligent, interesting, and educated man, and they began an affair within the first few days of their acquaintance. Schurer was 29 years old at the time, but the small age difference did not bother her. Their relationship lasted for a week while Torgny was on vacation at the hotel. After he left, they continued to call each other and correspond via the internet. A few months later, Christine came to Hellberg in Sweden and literally begged to stay with him. Even then, Torgny found her behavior too pushy and even tactless. When Christine offered him a weekend trip to the mountains, he refused, earnestly hoping that this would be the last time they saw each other. But she kept calling him, writing to him, and insisting on another meeting. In January 2007, Torgny directly told Christine in a phone call that it was over between them and that they should no longer meet. But Christine continued to call as if she hadn't heard him. She asked to visit him and invited him to go on vacation together. In the spring of 2007, she came to Sweden again and began to literally stalk her ex. She tried to persuade him to resume the relationship, although he honestly admitted that he was already with another woman. Then Christine said that she had forgotten some things at his house during her last trip and that she now needed to pick them up. Torgny agreed, but as soon as they entered the house, the ex-lover tried to seduce him. After he decisively rejected her, she said he would regret it. 3 months later, Christine returned again, apologized for her behavior, and tried again to persuade him to meet. But Torgny rejected her again. That evening, she called and said she had taken pills because she didn't want to live without him. Hellberg called an ambulance for her, contacted her family, and advised her to see a psychiatrist. After Christine received the necessary treatment at the hospital, her mother picked her up and sent her to a psychiatric clinic where she stayed for over a month. However, the treatment did not bring the desired success, and she remained obsessed with her ex, constantly thinking about how she could win him back and inventing new reasons for meeting. In October 2007, Christine decided to move to Sweden and settled in a suburb of Stockholm, where she rented an apartment with another woman. She began to stalk her ex again. One day when she met him, she told him that she had had a son by him, but had given the child to a foster family. Torgny was shocked by this news, but what interested him most was when it had happened. The last time they had slept together was over a year ago, and during that time they had only met 3 times, and Christine had shown no signs of pregnancy. When he started asking questions, she answered evasively, adding new details each time. In January 2008, after dozens of unsuccessful attempts to meet with him, Christine announced that her son had been diagnosed with some kind of hereditary disease and that they now had to travel to Germany to visit him. She also added that the boy's adoptive father would contact him and tell him all the details. At this time, Torgny and Emma were in the process of moving into their new house, and Emma knew the whole story. She believed that Torgny's ex-girlfriend was only trying to lure him to Germany and that no son existed. When Torgny received a call from a man who introduced himself as the adoptive father of his and Christine's child, he began, at Emma's suggestion, to ask questions. When the boy was born, in which hospital, and so on. The man was visibly annoyed, tried not to answer, and finally just hung up. Torgny was ultimately convinced that there was no son and that Christine had made it all up by asking someone she knew to play along. After hearing such a convoluted story, investigators quickly found out where the new suspect lived and drove to that address. The door was opened by Christine's neighbor, who informed them that Christine had packed her bags in a hurry the day before and returned to Germany. A check revealed that Christine had indeed left the country, so the Swedish police had to enlist the help of their German colleagues to arrest her. On March 20, an arrest warrant was issued against her. Upon her arrest, Christine claimed it was a mistake and that she had nothing to do with the murder. When she was brought to Sweden on March 29, she asked for a meeting with Torgny, which was denied. Christine behaved completely calmly but kept asking if she could meet her ex or at least call him. Christine's rented apartment was thoroughly searched. Her phone and laptop were confiscated and all her belongings, including her clothes, were thoroughly examined. No traces of blood were found. By this point, investigators had already determined which of the bloody prints at the crime scene did not belong to paramedics or family members. Based on the print, it could be determined that they were sports shoes. We were able to determine the brand and appearance of the shoes. The shoe size matched the size worn by the suspect. However, Christine claimed she had never worn such a shoe model. This claim was quickly refuted by her neighbor, who identified the shoes. An even more interesting discovery awaited investigators in Christine's laptop. It was full of photos of Torgny, both together and those where the man was alone or with his new girlfriend. In a separate folder with an unpleasant name, there were also photos of Emma and her children that Christine had copied from her rival's social media pages. Each of the photos was signed by Scherer with insulting, threatening, and frankly terrifying comments. The seized search history contained queries such as how to commit a murder without leaving traces, how to cover up a crime, how to divert suspicion from oneself. The notes also contained a plan of Emma's and Torgny's apartment, records of when the man went to work and when he returned, as well as other details about the family's daily routine. Emma's condition stabilized and gradually began to improve. At the end of March, doctors decided to gradually awaken her from the artificial coma. When she woke up, she still couldn't speak because of the breathing tube, but her gaze indicated that she was aware. It was clear that she recognized her relatives in the ward. However, she still didn't understand what was wrong with her and why she was in the hospital. After Emma's condition improved and she could speak again, the police decided to talk to her. However, they decided not to tell her what had happened to her children. Emma could not remember the events of that fateful day and was sure she had been in a car accident. She kept asking about the children and how they were. Initially, she received evasive answers, but then the family and the team decided there was no point in hiding the truth. When Emma learned what had happened and that her children were no longer alive, she became hysterical. The doctors had to give her sedatives, after which she fell asleep. When she woke up, she remembered nothing again and asked about her children again. This went on for several weeks, and during this time she was told several times that her son and daughter had died, but her brain apparently refused to accept this information and deleted it from her memory each time. After another month, Emma decided to return to the crime scene, accompanied by paramedics. As she entered the house, she suddenly remembered everything. The young woman said she had been writing a message to her sister and setting the table while the children played nearby. There was a knock at the door and she went to open it. A dark, small female figure stood on the threshold. When Emma asked what she wanted, she felt a piercing pain. Everything went dark and the figure stepped through the door. Emma, with her last strength, tried to catch up to her to protect the children but apparently fell into the corridor where she was attacked again, and they tried to kill her. Christine continued to stubbornly deny her guilt. The murder weapon was never found, and most of the collected evidence was circumstantial, giving her a good chance of going unpunished. However, Christine's flatmate reported during her interrogation that a hammer had disappeared from her toolbox in March. She showed the investigators the toolbox, and they determined that the size and shape of the tool matched the murder weapon. But even that was only circumstantial evidence. Investigators managed to find video footage from a bus stop in the suburb where Christine had appeared 3 times in the week before the crime. She could not explain why she traveled to Abuja so often, but she apparently came to keep an eye on her future victims. The suspect also could not explain why she searched the internet for information on covering up crimes and why she collected photos of Emma and her children. On July 29, 2008, the trial against Christine began. She was accused of double murder with particular cruelty as well as attempted murder. During the trial, she behaved more than strangely. When she entered the courtroom, she smiled and waved as if greeting everyone present. When she was asked questions about the massacre and shown horrifying images of the crime scene with the mutilated bodies, she suddenly began to laugh. This led some to believe she was mentally disturbed. However, the ordered psychiatric evaluation found that Christine was sane and fully aware of what had happened. Consequently, she enjoyed her actions and did not even try to hide them. When Emma was present in the courtroom and saw Christine, she fainted. When she regained consciousness, she said she now remembered everything and that Christine's face was the last thing she had seen on that fateful day. Despite her lawyers' attempts to prove their client's innocence, the jury unanimously found her guilty on all counts. Christine was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. She was also ordered to pay euros 20,000 in compensation to Emma. No evidence was found that Christine was ever pregnant or gave birth to a son by Torgny. Emma's recovery process was long and difficult, but Torgny did not abandon his beloved. In the summer of 2010, they married. The couple is now raising 2 children together who know the sad story of their older brother and sister. After Christine was sentenced to life imprisonment, Torgny and Emma's lives gradually began to improve, however. This terrible story left deep marks on their fate. Although Emma tried to forget the tragedy and build a new life, she constantly felt the presence of something ominous, as if Christine's shadow would not let her go even after her incarceration. If you liked the video, please give it a like. That helps a lot with its spread. Also, leave a comment to support the channel and recommend the video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Thanks for watching and take care. The struggle of 2 therapists, a relationship between a cousin and a sister, 22 years age difference. I don't know why I kept postponing it, but when I started studying the material, it became clear to me that the story is valuable and instructive. Jacob Nolan was born in 1991 into a wealthy family and lived in Miami, Florida. He was the 3rd and youngest child and received the greatest love from his parents. His mother and father considered Jacob gifted, intelligent, and very resourceful. They saw that he was different and stood out from his peers, yet at the age of 5, the boy was diagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. When Jacob turned 15, his parents noticed that the boy was experiencing increasingly frequent severe mood swings. Nevertheless, he was better at school than others. Once, he developed a learning application for smartphones and won a competition in Miami with it. A month later, Jacob could no longer get up. He just lay on the bed and didn't want to do anything, not even get up. His parents pleaded with their son to go to school, but Jacob did not listen to them. Mother and father invited a doctor who diagnosed the boy with depression and an anxiety disorder. At the age of 17, Jacob Nolan said that he no longer wanted to live. The parents were very concerned about their son's behavior and condition and sent him to the hospital, where he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is a severe chronic mental illness characterized by dramatic mood swings ranging from deep depression to periods of incredible emotional highs. The patient is a prisoner of their own thoughts. They can achieve nothing in life as their grandiose plans repeatedly end in a depressive episode. After high school, Jacob attended college. Parallel to his studies, he was constantly undergoing treatment. Psychiatrists prescribed him increasingly stronger medications. In total, Jacob Nolan underwent dozens of treatments between the ages of 17 and 20, taking 5 to 6 pills per day and changing about 30 medications. But nothing had a positive effect. The year 2012 arrived. The 21-year-old Jacob Nolan was still going downhill. His parents worried about their son and didn't know what to do next. Then, one day, they received a call from their relatives in New York, Pamela Butchbinder, who offered her help. "God has finally answered our prayers," exclaimed Jacob Nolan's parents, but if they had known what was coming for their family, they would never have accepted the help. Pamela Butchbinder, 43, worked as a psychotherapist and lived with her 4-year-old son, Calder, in Manhattan's Chelsea neighborhood. Jacob Nolan and Pamela Butchbinder were cousins with an age difference of 22 years. Jacob was her son's godfather. In 2012, Pamela expressed her desire to help her cousin. The woman offered him to move from Florida to her in New York to her apartment in Chelsea. At home, she conducted personal psychotherapy sessions with him and prescribed him the necessary pills. In return, Jacob had to take care of his godson, Calder. The young man admitted that a warm relationship quickly developed between him and Pamela. He had full trust in the adult, experienced woman and regarded her as an authority. In this photo, Jacob is lying in bed with Pamela and laughing. You can see that he feels comfortable. He is at her home. But don't forget that this photo is not just of two people with a family bond, but of a therapist and her patient. Pamela sent Jacob mixed messages on the phone. Here is the text. "You are wonderful, you are brilliant, I have so many thoughts about you, sweet Jake, you are the funniest person, you are so beautiful, I miss you terribly." Jacob loved Calder very much. He treated him like his own son and tried to do good to be a role model for his godson. The plan worked. The 21-year-old Jacob Nolan, who had suffered from a mental disorder for years, seemed to awaken to life again. He was stable, often joked, and had a smile on his face. But unfortunately, the happiness did not last long. Some time after the cousin moved in, Pamela began to complain to him more and more often about her ex-husband, Michael Weiss, Calder's father. Pamela ended her relationship with this man shortly after the birth of their son. Michael Weiss, 38, also worked as a therapist. Outwardly, Michael and Pamela seemed to be a good, calm, loving couple. They attended parties together and enjoyed relaxing at large celebrations. In this photo, Michael and Pamela are celebrating Jacob Nolan's birthday together, for whom his parents organized a big party at one of the expensive bars in Miami. However, not everything in Michael and Pamela's life together was as rosy as in this photo. It is known that both went to the police because of domestic violence. Once, Pamela attacked Michael with a piece of broken glass in her hand. The man then sought a doctor, had the wound stitched, and filed a police report the same day. Pamela was arrested and charged with assault. However, Michael soon forgave the woman and withdrew his complaint. The couple reconciled, but a few months later, Pamela herself went to the police and reported that Michael had threatened her and wanted to kill her. A few weeks later, Pamela withdrew her statement. Michael and Pamela were never officially married. Their relationship lasted about 4 years. After the woman gave birth to a son in 2008, she finally separated from Michael. The two therapists could no longer get along under one roof. Their stormy relationship ended. But a new battle began, the fight for custody of their shared son, Calder. Every day, Pamela spoke disparagingly to Jacob about her former partner. She complained that Michael did not want to pay child support and then even claimed that when the son spent time with his own father, he would do terrible things to him that he couldn't bring himself to talk about. On the morning of November 12, 2012, Jacob Nolan woke up to Pamela's gentle touches. The woman climbed into bed with him, stroked the young man's back, and whispered words of love into his ear. Jacob lay in bed, continuing to receive compliments. "You are my savior. You are the most amazing man in the world because no one but you understands me," Pamela repeatedly whispered to her cousin. But soon the woman's loving mood vanished. Pamela took a black sports bag from the closet and placed a long-handled hammer and a kitchen knife inside. She began to cry hysterically and told Jacob that today was the day he had to deal with Michael Weiss. Pamela handed him a piece of paper on which several entrances to the multi-story office building where Michael Weiss, the psychotherapist, treated patients were drawn. Jacob got up, grabbed the bag, put the sketch in his pocket, and went to the building. Before he left, Pamela said, "Today is the day our lives will change and get better because Michael will be eliminated." And Jacob made his way to the high-rise building in the middle of Manhattan. He walked around the building, observing it from different angles. The young man entered through the service entrance. A surveillance photo captured him doing so. Jacob checked in on the ground floor, gave his real name, and said he was on his way to the tutoring center. He was allowed through. Jacob took the elevator to the 12th floor and headed for Weiss's office. He heard through the door that a patient appointment was taking place inside. Jacob remained in the corridor, waiting for the appointment to end and for Michael Weiss to be alone. During the long wait, Jacob was nervous, and thoughts rushed through his mind that everything he was doing was wrong. At one point, he wanted to leave and run home, but the thought of returning to Pamela without having fulfilled her request, and thus upsetting her, was stronger. Jacob realized he had no other choice. After the patient left, Jacob entered the office and told Michael that Pamela had asked him to pick up financial documents for Calder's daycare. While Michael was looking for the paperwork, Jacob asked to use the restroom. He went into the bathroom with his black bag, took out a knife, and put it in his pocket. Then he took out the huge hammer, came out of the bathroom, went directly to Michael, and swung it. Fortunately, the doctor reacted in time. He ducked, and the hammer only hit him on the shoulder. Then Jacob pulled the knife from his pocket, and the fight began. Michael was physically larger than Jacob. He quickly defended himself against the man and fought back. At some point, the men moved out into the hallway. Jacob screamed like a madman and called for help. His screams were immediately heard by others who thought the doctor was being attacked by his mentally ill patient. They called emergency services and reported the incident. Before the police and paramedics arrived, the exhausted Jacob and Michael sat in the hallway. Jacob took his cell phone out of his pocket and took this selfie. He then sent it to Pamela, asking what he should do next, but he received no answer. Things looked very strange. Jacob did not try to flee. Soon after, the police and ambulance arrived. The injured men were taken to the hospital for medical treatment. Fortunately, neither of them sustained life-threatening injuries. Michael Weiss was treated and discharged home the same day. Jacob's injuries turned out to be more severe. To make matters worse, doctors determined that the man was in a manic state upon admission and had to administer strong medication to him. Jacob Nolan was arrested directly in the hospital while he was being treated. There, he also wrote a long message to Pamela, informing her of what had happened to him and Michael. The woman ignored his message for a long time but later still asked which hospital he was in. Pamela arrived, but she was not allowed to see him as he was already handcuffed to the bed at that time. He spent 4 days in the hospital, after which he was discharged and taken to a prison cell. He was released from pretrial detention on a $50,000 bail. Jacob was allowed to fly from New York to his parents in Florida. A few weeks after the terrible incident, Michael Weiss filed a lawsuit against his former partner, Pamela Buchbinder, accusing her of conspiracy. Michael Weiss claimed it was dangerous to be with Buchbinder and that his son should live with him. He presented video footage from a hardware store showing Pamela and Jacob jointly buying a hammer the day before the attack. The purchase was paid for in cash by the woman. Pamela denied any involvement in the case. She stated that she had asked Jacob to take Michael's financial documents, but not that she had asked her cousin to attack her ex. She did not deny giving him a knife, but she did so that he could protect her son, as the building where Michael Weiss worked had a daycare on the ground floor, which Calder attended. The only thing the woman could never explain was why she bought the hammer the day before the attack. Soon, a family court judge ordered that Michael receive full custody of his biological son, Calder, and prohibited Pamela Buchbinder from any contact with her son for 5 years. Only several months after the act did Jacob Nolan openly accuse his cousin Pamela that the attack on Michael Weiss had been solely her idea. Jacob admitted that Buchbinder had carefully planned the crime. She wanted him to go to Weiss's office and hit him on the head, playing the Beatles song Maxwell's Silver Hammer beforehand. Jacob claimed he didn't know what he was doing. Pamela had completely taken over his mind. He didn't even think of inventing a false name when he entered the office center, so distraught was he. The woman told the man every day that Michael was hurting her son. It turned out there was not a single piece of evidence for her words. No one had ever heard Michael yelling at Calder or saying anything bad to him. On the contrary, those close to him said that the man loved his son very much. Despite the strange photos in bed that might suggest Jacob and Pamela were close, the man denied an intimate relationship with his cousin, and as for the love messages, they were simply friendly communication. Jacob revealed that he considered Pamela family, felt close to her and trusted her completely. Jacob's parents were distraught. They fully supported their son and claimed Pamela had brainwashed him using psychological techniques from her practice. The trial dragged on. 4 years after the act, in 2016, journalists met Jacob Nolan before another hearing, and he agreed to a short interview. The young man looked good, and he answered questions clearly and reasonably. Jacob said that he had been taking medication for over 1.5 years and was finally feeling an improvement in his psycho-emotional state. The 4 years leading up to the trial flew by. He spent most of his time in hospitals and psychiatric facilities. In addition to his mental problems, he tried to recover from his addiction. He said that in May 2015, his life was again at stake. Then he fell into a coma due to severe poisoning from illegal substances. Doctors gave Jacob no chance of survival, but a miracle happened. He regained consciousness and soon recovered. In March 2016, Jacob Nolan's trial began. He claimed Pamela Buchbinder had forced him to attack Michael Weiss. At the time of the act, the man believed this was the only chance to save his godson, Calder. The prosecution described Jacob as a spoiled child of wealthy parents. They said Jacob had told a total of 3 different versions of events and had been confused repeatedly. When the police first arrived at Michael Weiss's practice, Jake pointed at the therapist and said, "He is the one who attacked me with a knife." When questioned, he claimed he had never swung the hammer in Michael's office. He said he had brought the hammer for self-defense because he was afraid of Weiss. According to Jacob's third version, Michael Weiss was the first to pull the hammer from his bag and attack him. But how could Michael Weiss have known that Jacob had the tool in his bag? The prosecution provided another important piece of information in the case, which they considered the main motive for the attack on Michael Weiss. It turned out that Michael had taken out a life insurance policy worth $1.5 million shortly before the tragedy. The beneficiary was his son, Calder. However, just 3 days before the attack, on November 9, 2012, Michael Weiss agreed to put Pamela Buchbinder's name on the policy and allow her to manage his son's money. Jacob said that he had heard about the insurance policy for the first time then, and that Pamela had never told him anything about her personal financial affairs. In the trial, it became known that Pamela and Jacob had also bought plastic cable ties in a hardware store in addition to the hammer. The defendant confirmed this and made another open confession. Jacob revealed that Pamela had asked him to do more than just kill Michael Weiss. She wanted the man to suffer before he died and described the brutal acts Jacob was supposed to inflict on Michael. Before the public, the man told the woman that he would not do it, as he was not capable of such extreme cruelty, but he agreed just to kill. He also said that Pamela wanted to make a homemade weapon from an air pistol, but when they arrived at the hardware store, they decided it would be easier and better to use a hammer. Jacob Nolan's lawyers did not deny that he committed the act. They wanted the man to be declared legally insane. However, as practice shows, this is very difficult to prove. Unfortunately, there are no blood tests, X-rays, or other tests that can look into a person's mind and accurately say what they thought and felt at the time of the act. Conclusions are drawn from conversations during the initial questioning, police reports in medical records, and nowadays sometimes from social media posts. It is also not uncommon for 2 different psychiatrists to provide 2 different expert opinions. All of this often confuses judges and juries. Mental illnesses often affect feelings, thoughts, and behavior, but at the trial, Jacob Nolan understood exactly what he had done and admitted that his act was wrong and terrible. Jacob did not look like a madman. At the trial, he was very good-looking, eloquent, well-dressed, and answered questions clearly and precisely. Pamela Buchbinder herself, by the way, was not present at the trial. Neither the prosecution nor the defense had called the woman as a witness. And since Jacob suffered from a mental disorder, the defense lawyers hardly believed his words that Pamela was the initiator of the attack. It is known that Jacob Nolan's lawyers had hired private investigators to shadow Pamela Buchbinder even before the trial, but no one could find her. The woman's apartment was empty. In March 2016, the 24-year-old Jacob Nolan was found guilty of attempted murder and second-degree assault after a 2-week trial. The man was sentenced to 9.5 years in prison. Had he been found legally insane at the time of the act, he would have faced a longer period in a treatment facility. Jacob was very upset when he learned how much time he had to spend behind bars. "That's not fair, I'm not a danger to society," he said. Jacob's parents believed that the decision to send their son to his cousin was the biggest mistake of their lives. Another year passed. On October 19, 2017, almost 5 years after the attack on Michael Weiss, police officers tracked down Pamela Buchbinder in Syracuse, New York. The Manhattan District Attorney had accused Pamela of instructing Jacob Nolan to kill her former partner, Michael Weiss. At the time of her arrest, the woman's handbag contained her passport, Calder's birth certificate, and his expired passport. Pamela was arrested and taken into custody. The woman continued to deny her guilt. She hired 2 of New York's best and most expensive lawyers, who immediately claimed that the video footage of Pamela buying the hammer was fake. The lawyers demanded that Buchbinder be released on a $1.5 million bail. They did not stop arguing that Pamela was an educated person, a psychotherapist, and it would never have occurred to her to organize a murder. For all 5 years after Jacob's attack on Michael, Pamela lived a normal life. She worked, rented an apartment. The woman did not hide or flee to another country. The only thing she did was avoid journalists and not comment on Nolan's crime. Pamela's lawyers presented new, in their opinion, important evidence in court. A note allegedly written by Jacob Nolan, which he gave to his mother immediately after the attack on Michael Weiss in 2022 at the hospital. In the note, Jacob wrote, "Pamela had nothing to do with it." The Buchbinder's lawyers considered this a crucial piece of evidence that could have allowed the woman's release on bail, but the judge rejected the motion, believing that Jacob Nolan was in a manic state during his hospital stay and therefore his note should not be believed. Pamela Buchbinder was imprisoned at the notorious Rikers Island jail in New York before her trial. She remained there for a full 5 years due to legal disputes and a pandemic. Only on September 7, 2022, did Pamela make a statement at a pretrial hearing. The woman agreed to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. However, a month later, she changed her mind and retracted her confession. Pamela reported that on the day she agreed to the plea deal, she had already been physically assaulted by prison guards in the morning. Furthermore, she had not taken her medication that day and began to feel ill. The woman was then put on a bus and taken to the courthouse. Next to her, another inmate was smoking illegal substances. Pamela claimed she felt the effects of these substances on herself while sitting next to the two. Her consciousness changed, and during a further interrogation, she confessed to the crime. The judge did not accept this acquittal by Pamela Buchbinder and ordered the maintenance of the agreement and the continuation of the criminal proceedings. According to the prosecutor, Pamela's love for Michael turned into hate. She tried to control the man, monitored his life, and wanted to receive $1.5 million from the insurance company. Pamela Buchbinder's own address during the trial was short. "I am very sorry that we are all gathered here today." What the prosecutor said may have been true. Pamela Buchbinder was found guilty and sentenced to 11 years in prison. After the verdict was announced, the woman turned with a sad gaze to her relatives, who sent her air kisses. To this day, it is known that Jacob Nolan and Pamela Buchbinder are still serving their sentences in different correctional facilities in New York. Jacob will be released in 2024 and Pamela in 2027. Jacob communicates regularly with his parents by phone. The young man admitted that he thinks about his terrible deed every night. He is completely remorseful and has even expressed a desire to meet Michael Weiss personally, hug him, and ask for forgiveness. Jacob is sure that Pamela Buchbinder used him for her own dirty purposes. She did not care what happened to her cousin next. When Pamela is released, her son Calder will be 19 years old. He is now being raised by his own father, Michael Weiss, who still works as a psychotherapist and treats patients in central Manhattan. The man makes no secret of the fact that he still suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder after the attack. He constantly looks around on the street and is afraid that the unpleasant story will repeat itself. Michael has no doubt that Pamela Buchbinder still hates him and will not stop pursuing him even after her release. If you liked the video, please give it a like. That helps a lot with its distribution. Also, leave a comment to support the channel and recommend the video further. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Thanks for watching and take care. Today's video tells the mysterious story of a terrible crime that occurred in 1959. The investigation in this case lasted exactly 65 years. Only in mid-November 2024 will the victim's identity be established, and many of the investigators' questions will be answered. In the late 1950s, Mequon, Wisconsin was a quiet and prosperous town. With its well-maintained streets surrounded by dense forests and fields, it felt cozy and safe. Today, Mequon is the most populous city in Ozaukee County. But back then, only 8,000 people lived there peacefully together, and almost everyone knew everyone by name. In this idyllic atmosphere of peace and tranquility, On October 4, 1959, a resident near Davis Road was picking flowers. The only thing that could have disturbed the woman on that warm Sunday afternoon was the looming rain, which might have prevented her from picking a large bouquet of her favorite autumn flowers. But the immediate future looked much bleaker. At one point, the nature lover approached a culvert and saw something she would probably never forget for the rest of her life. In the culvert lay the disfigured remains of a human being. The entire area's police rushed to the scene of the gruesome discovery. It turned out that a head with blonde hair and some other skeletal parts were lying near the drain. In total, in the first 24 hours of the investigation, the police found bones from legs, arms, and parts of the torso. About 1 kilometer further north, they found a partially burned cardboard box that at first glance appeared to contain skin and bone fragments, as well as a cloth bag, work pants, and a Milwaukee newspaper from May 1959. At the end of the day, it started to rain, which the woman who had been picking flowers had feared so much, as she did not yet know what she would soon experience. The bad weather brought the first day of the search to an end. But over the next week, investigators, while searching the topsoil under the pipe, found almost the entire skeleton of the victim. Although all forensic examinations were still pending, Mequon Police Chief Robert Meek, trusting his experience, said, "There is no doubt that this man was murdered." The body had been exposed to very strong environmental influences, so it could not be determined how long the man had been dead. Ozaukee County Medical Examiner Dr. James Walsh examined the body on the day of its discovery and concluded that the victim had been outdoors for 2 to 4 months. Later, this period was extended to 6 months. This aspect was the first mystery of the mysterious case, but by no means the last. Initially, it was determined that the victim was a girl between 6 and 8 years old. However, a more thorough examination later cast doubt on this claim. Charles Wilson, the head of the State Criminal Laboratory, was unable to definitively determine the sex of the discovered remains. The police began questioning residents, and it quickly became clear that a man living nearby had seen a car some months ago from which a child's arm was hanging down. The witness called the police, but they arrived too late. The car with the mysterious cargo had already driven away. This report and the newspaper dated May 1959 gave a very precise idea of the time of the crime. Investigators searched all district records for information on missing persons. It turned out that precisely in May 1959, 6-year-old Nancy Mary Ritchie had disappeared with her mother in neighboring Milwaukee. The girl's father soon after appeared at the state crime lab with a lock of his daughter's hair, but the body could not be identified. Since the police had by then learned from the medical examiner that several healed fractures had been found on the remains, Chief Meek contacted doctors who might have treated Nancy for similar injuries, hoping that X-rays had been preserved that the police could examine. None of the doctors ever came forward. Finally, the girl and her mother were found alive, and everyone rejoiced at this outcome. In this way, however, such a promising lead came to a dead end. In the meantime, a woman from Cincinnati, 750 km from Mequon, contacted the local police station, assuming that the discovered remains belonged to her missing 6-year-old granddaughter, Phyllis Jonf. But this lead also turned out to be false. The regional authorities mobilized all available police forces and the best experts, but could neither solve the case nor identify the victim. Eventually, the body remained in the Madison City Laboratory and was assigned identification number 6426GR. Josephine Brainy was born in 1931. According to the possibilities of the first third of the 20th century, Josephine was the child of 36-year-old Anna Louise, which cannot be said of her then 66-year-old father, Jacob. The man had worked for many years at the Royal Mill. For health reasons, he had to give up his job in 1932 when Josephine was only 1 year old. Less than 7 years later, the head of the family died, and when the girl was 16 years old, she lost her mother. In middle age, Anne Brainey began to struggle with a severe mental illness. Doctors diagnosed her with involutional melancholia, a term describing psychiatric complaints often diagnosed in women during menopause. The symptoms of Anna's condition would today be described as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or depression. In January 1948, she was admitted to Newbury State Hospital, and only 2 weeks later, on February 9, she died, according to hospital records, of exhaustion caused by mental illness. Undoubtedly, her mother's illness and subsequent death had profound effects on Josephine. 4 years later, she became pregnant and on February 26, 1952, gave birth to a son whom she named Chester Alfred Brainey. Of the child's father, it is only known that he could not or would not care for either the mother of his future child or himself. It is not known what the relationship was like between Josephine's several married sisters, the youngest of whom was then 26 years old, and her brother, who was 17 years her senior, but they obviously had no intention of helping the lonely young mother. Finally, the young woman, who had no support whatsoever and was in distress, made a self-sacrificing decision and gave her newborn child up for adoption to a loving family who could offer him a better life. As stated in her obituary, she died in 2000 at the age of 70. The documents tell the story of the child's arrival at the boarding school a little more prosaically. Months after the birth of her son, the Houghton County Probate Court decided that Josephine was unable to care for the child and committed him to the Goodwill Farm Orphanage in the same town of Houghton where the boy was born. The name of the orphanage is no coincidence. Pastor Halljausen founded the orphanage and school for children who had lost their fathers in mining accidents in 1900 on a real farm. It was later replaced by a large brick building near the campus of the Michigan Institute of Technology. At that time, it was one of the few facilities of its kind in the region, which is why practically all locals who wanted to adopt a child turned to Goodwill Farm. This is exactly what happened in our criminal story. William Russell Utila was one of at least 10 children of Michael M. in Finnish and Alida Jutila from Torch Lake Township. William's parents came from Finland to the United States and settled in a region where many people from their home country lived. One day, the boy saw a picture of a young divorced woman from Finland in his aunt's house, and it was something like love at first sight. The aunt organized the couple's correspondence, and so their courtship began. Finally, 26-year-old Hilja Pusker sailed to the United States in May 1950 to meet her future husband. A few days after her arrival in America, she and William married. It was a happy marriage, but one important aspect was missing for the young couple. They both dreamed of having a child. 1.5 years after their marriage, they concluded that it would not be possible for them to have their own child and decided to apply to the Goodwill Farm Orphanage. In November 1952, the orphanage informed William and Hilja that they had a boy named Chester in their care who had been deprived of his parents by court order. The home asked if they would be willing to foster the child. The couple replied that they were willing to do so. Chester moved into their home that same day. The new parents met with their son's birth mother, Josephine Brainey, but only at first. Later, they were no longer interested in these meetings. Chester's official adoption took place 2.5 years after the actual adoption, on March 24, 1955. By this time, he had already received a new Finnish name, Markku Edward Michael Jutila. William and Hilja's native language was Finnish, and they taught it to their son. When Markku started school, he therefore understood little English. In December 1958, life in the Jutila household was hardly carefree. William had been unable to work in the mine for 2 years due to a leg injury. In fact, Hilja was the sole breadwinner for the family. The woman earned money by washing and ironing laundry at home. Shortly before Christmas, William's parents came to visit, but to their surprise, they did not find the family in their house. The perplexed people saw Hilja's laundry hanging on lines. However, it looked as if no one had been in the house for a long time. William's brothers broke into the house and found that the family had obviously left the apartment in a hurry. Food had been left in the kitchen in the middle of preparation. Neither William nor his wife had left a message. They had simply vanished without a trace. Over the years, the large Jutila family knew nothing about their disappeared relatives. 7 years passed in this uncertainty, and then suddenly, at the end of 1965, a letter arrived from William, reporting on their life in a new place and even providing the address of their new home in Chicago. Shortly after receiving this news, William's brothers traveled a short distance further and came to visit him. To their great surprise, the family consisted of only 2 people. Marku was nowhere to be found. The parents explained that the child was being treated in a hospital for mentally handicapped children. This explanation seemed extremely strange to them, as no one close to him had ever noticed anything unusual in the boy's behavior. With heavy hearts, the men returned home. After some time, however, they came again, this time without announcing their intentions. Again, the men asked, where was the child? This time, their younger brother William said that the child was just playing in the neighborhood. As much as the brothers loved William, it was obvious that he was lying to them and something had clearly happened to Marku. Back in Michigan, the relatives contacted the Houghton County Sheriff's Department and reported William's strange behavior. The police officers took the information seriously and sent an entire team consisting of a sergeant, 2 investigators, and most importantly, Deputy Sheriff Francis Heidemann to Chicago. When the law enforcement officers knocked on the door of the Jutila family's house, it turned out that the couple had not expected the visit at all. After the initial questions, the couple began to coordinate their statements with each other in Finnish. They were sure that no one understood them and spoke everything openly, and that was their biggest mistake. Deputy Sheriff Heidemann was of Finnish descent and spoke Finnish as well as the Jutila couple. He told the other officers what he had heard, and William and Hilja's interrogation took a different turn. They were questioned separately, and the inconsistencies in their statements quickly became apparent. It seems surprising, but in all the years that had passed, they had never agreed on the details of a common version. In general, they claimed that their son had come home from school, felt sick, gone to bed, and died. They allegedly panicked because they feared being accused of not seeking medical attention in time, for which they had no money, and also said that they had no money to pay the funeral home. So they decided to dispose of the body themselves without calling official services. Out of fear of punishment, not only did the version of events seem ridiculous, but the details of the alleged events also differed for the couple. As the Chicago Tribune reported, Sergeant William Gorman finally addressed William Jutila and told him that his statement did not match his wife's. William broke down and said, "Marku is no more. Hilja beat him to death." Immediately after William's confession, Sergeant Gorman told Hilja, "Your husband has reconciled with God by confessing to the murder of his son." After these words, the woman cried and then said, "He is dead. We threw him into the culvert." After these confessions, she was naturally taken into custody. In the meantime, investigators set about examining all cases of unidentified bodies found along the couple's route from Houghton to Chicago. Soon they came across the case of a body found by a woman picking flowers in Mequon. However, as successful as they were in taking over the case, the subsequent investigations were unsuccessful. The suspects appeared before the Cook County Circuit Court on March 28, 2 days after their arrest. At the hearing, it turned out that the police had made an error in the paperwork during their arrest, and they had to be released immediately. This procedural error was quickly corrected, and the Jutila couple voluntarily agreed to be extradited to Michigan, where they had previously lived with their son. By this time, however, Hilja had already recanted her confession and insisted on her innocence, which she intended to prove. On April 1, 1966, already in Michigan, Jutila appeared before Haughton County Justice of the Peace Louis G. Becker. At this point, both spouses pleaded not guilty. They were taken into pretrial detention without bail. The couple's lawyers tried unsuccessfully for 3 months to get their clients released on bail. During pretrial detention, the spouses were examined one after another by psychiatrist Ivan Licker. The doctor noted in his report that both spouses were of normal intelligence and showed no signs of insanity or mental illness. Hilja, for example, spoke cheerfully about her adopted son, but only until it came to his death. Then she started to cry. William, for his part, insisted that he and his wife loved their son very much and were only guilty of having thrown the body into a culvert. It took about half a year for all investigations and other activities necessary for the trial to be completed. The first hearings only began in September 1966. Experts who had examined the body found in Mequon police officers who had arrested the couple, and numerous witnesses were summoned to court. It quickly became clear that the prosecution, despite the obviousness of the case, did not have enough evidence to accuse the Jutila couple of first-degree murder. In fact, apart from their own statements, there was nothing connecting them to the murder. The defendant's lawyers, the prosecutor, and the judge met repeatedly to discuss the situation. The fact is that in the mid-1960s, medicine could not determine whether the discovered body even belonged to Marco Jutila. Judge G. Becker took a lot of time to review all the evidence and aspects of the case, and even took several weeks to go through the audio recordings of the defendant's interrogations. In the end, he concluded that the prosecution's arguments were insufficient and granted the defense's motion to dismiss the case in full. William and Hilja Jutila were released. The couple returned to Haughton County, from which they had fled in December 1959, and lived there until their death as if nothing had happened. Hilja died on January 20, 1988 at the age of 63. William passed away only 3 months later on April 23, 1988 at the age of 65 or 66. But as it turned out many years later, this was not the end of the horror story. In 2023, the Criminal Division of the Wisconsin Department of Justice, in cooperation with the Ozaukee County Sheriff's Office and the Madison City Crime Lab, conducted a DNA test on the body found in 1959 and uploaded the resulting profile to the nationwide CODIS database. But no match was found. Since standard DNA tests did not yield results, the material was sent to the well-known Othram lab in the Woodlands. The researchers invested a lot of effort, but in the end it paid off. 65 years after the murder, the body was identified as Chester Alfred Brainy, alias Marco Jutila. The funeral service for Chester Brainy took place on Friday, November 15, 2024, at St. John's Church in Port Washington, Wisconsin. The funeral procession went from the church to St. Mary Cemetery. The costs for Chester's funeral service and burial were borne by residents who were touched by his sad fate. The case of Chester Alfred Brainy was the 6th case in Wisconsin solved with the technology developed by Othram Labs. If you liked the video, please give it a like. That helps a lot with its spread. Also, leave a comment to support the channel and recommend the video further. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Thanks for watching and take care.